What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review episode 5 of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, an episode called Partings, which was written by Justin Doble, and it was directed by Wang Che Yip. And I should say from the outset, I'm a little beat up from traveling today. I had a lot of delayed flights, bad weather, bumpy rides, lost luggage, and so I might be more than unusually harsh on this show because when you're completely exhausted, it's hard to ignore a show's missed opportunities. And I think that if I were to characterize this show 5 episodes deep, it's continuing to feel like a series of missed opportunities for greatness, missed opportunities for soaring emotion, missed opportunities for just pure escapist fantasy, just epic storytelling, poetry, grandeur. It's all lacking. All the qualities that define J.R.R. Tolkien's books are completely, utterly lacking from this show. And what it's starting to remind me of is when you have Americans who are trying and failing to do like English accents or put on Shakespeare, basically trying and failing to capture a culture that's just a little bit beyond their grasp. And I feel like this show, the tone, the atmosphere, just the backdrop, everything's just a little bit beyond the grasp of the writers and the filmmakers, and it just comes across as inauthentic, pretentious, oftentimes annoying or clumsy. And perhaps the reason I'm being so harsh is because this was the first episode of all 5 where there wasn't a single beat or shot or moment or scene where I felt satisfied as a fan of this world. And that was kind of depressing, and even more wounding or more grievous and most loathsome of all was this reinventing of the lore behind the creation of Mithril, where I just couldn't believe the fucking bullshit that they were just shoveling out onto this episode, trying to imply that somehow there was an elf and a Balrog that were once fighting over a tree where the light of the Silmarils was contained and that a lightning bolt struck it. That the essence of the tree went down into the ground, creating Mithril, and that somehow now that unless the elves are subjected to grand quantities of Mithril, that the light of the Eldar will fade, and that they'll either have to fade away and become mortal, or they'll all have to sail away to Valinor. I mean, I wanted to fucking vomit. And it's fine when they are trying to kind of work between the lines and flesh things out where there's no material to work from, because obviously they're only working from the appendices at the end of The Lord of the Rings. There's not a lot of material to work with. But when you invent a bunch of bullshit that just directly contradicts what we know about something like Mithril, that's really annoying. And that's when, as a fan of Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien, etc., that's when I have to basically say, stop, enough. Y'all are seriously fucking up this show. Maybe I'm just tired of giving the show one chance after another to live up to the legacy of Tolkien or to live up to the legacy of all the stories that are set in Middle-earth. And it's incredible to me how little this show has accomplished after being given so much in terms of the lore, the backdrop, the setting, the resources at their disposal, the pre-existing fan base, the just fawning supportive media coverage, and this giant platform with incredible reach. This show had everything, basically everything imaginable working in its favor ahead of time, and it lacks that spark, it lacks the imagination, it lacks the creativity, it just lacks that pulse that gives life and energy and passion to great stories. Like classic stories should give you this heightened sense of emotional experience. And I think this show's basically designed for people who want the facade of drama. They want the facade of spectacle, but they don't really want anything too exciting or too upsetting. They just want to be kind of lulled into this complacent stupor, or at least the writers and directors associated with this show think that's what the people want. Because here we are, like, if you were to add up all 5 episodes, all of which are like an hour and 10 minutes, so you basically have about 6 hours total of runtime at this point, which is as long as the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers, the theatrical cuts, put together. And think about all the incredible things that we saw in those first 2 films. And this show, it feels like it's still struggling to find a way just to even get started. It's like, what's your fucking rush? Like, Like, let loose the animal. Like, get out of your own way and just tell the goddamn story. And as I was watching Adar and his orcs marching upon this tower down in the Southlands, all it reminded me of was how much better a similar scene was in the Two Towers when we see the Uruk-hai marching on Helm's Deep. Let's just say that the story with Bronwyn trying to rally her people for, actually, she's not even really trying that hard. At one point, she's ready to just completely go over to the other side. But go back and rewatch that build up in the Two Towers when Theoden's trying to rally his people, and then they get reinforced by the elves of Lothlorien, and it's just so epic and so stirring and just so fucking cool and badass across the board with the rain and the roaring and the combat. It is sheer bliss in the Two Towers, and goddamn, I mean, you want to talk about a piss poor imitation of a great scene. Just look at Adar's march on this tower, and I imagine that whatever battle scene that we're going to see in the next episode, if it even comes in the next episode, is going to be lackluster at best. And in spite of all my negativity, I haven't even mentioned yet my least favorite aspect of the show, the goddamn Harfoots and the Stranger, who are back this episode. We got a break from them last episode. I gave actually a modestly, kind of, sort of, non-committally favorable review of episode 4 because the Harfoots and the Stranger were not in that episode. But man, every single moment these characters are on screen, I'm just pulling out my baby hairs by the roots, just screaming in frustration. I can't stand the Harfoots. And here's my suspicion. I don't know if the Stranger's going to turn out to be Gandalf or one of the other wizards or one of the other Maiar. But if he does, in fact, turn out to be Gandalf, this is my prediction, that the show's point of view will be that the influence of Nori and Poppy are what make Gandalf into Gandalf the Grey that we all know and love. And therefore, indirectly, everything that Gandalf accomplishes in the Third Age and in the Lord of the Rings trilogy can all be indirectly attributed back to the influence of Nori and Poppy. That's just my really cynical, very, I guess, just pissed off prediction at this point. I would love nothing more than to be proven wrong. I would love nothing more than for all these characters to be fucking amazing. I would love nothing more than for this show to be amazing, but it just is not. And speaking of the Stranger, this episode gave us a brief glimpse of some of the evil characters that are tracking him and following him. They go to the location where he first crashed at the end of episode 1. And I'm operating under the assumption that blonde dude is Sauron, but who the hell knows? I mean, it might take till the end of season 2 for this show even to confirm which character that character happens to be. But they've got to do something with that character soon. This show is in desperate need of some villains, some scary villains. I mean, the orcs in this show are just pitiful. When all these humans show up to Adar's camp, wanting to, pledge their service to Sauron, there's this one orc standing beside Adar with like the lousiest prosthetics, the lamest expression on his face, an expression that can never change. And I was like, this looks like something that was made by like a high school musical. Like, bring in some real fucking orcs that actually look intimidating and scary. And if you need a frame of reference, go back and watch the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring when the last alliance of elves and men are attacking Mount Doom. There's some close-ups of some orcs there that look totally badass. So I realize I'm jumping around quite a bit and just basically lashing out at this show, but I didn't like this episode enough to want to even do a full and complete breakdown. I'd rather just call attention to certain beats, certain details that really annoyed the hell out of me, like Galadriel teaching combat lessons to the Númenóreans. And there's this ridiculous moment where she's instructing them on how to kill an orc, and she says, oh, you stab them in the chest and you twist the blade. It's like, oh, like, as opposed to all the other creatures on this planet that can be killed the exact same way. That kind of feigned expertise about combat by the writers is just annoying as hell. Like, anytime Aragorn or Boromir taught something to the hobbits in Fellowship of the Ring, like, oh my god, like, these guys have really lived and breathed the fight against the servants of Sauron for years and years and years, and you never called it into question once. And I think the portrayal of Galadriel in this show is just part of a much larger problem where these writers, they honestly have no idea how to write elves at all. In the context of this show, whether you're talking about Gil-galad or Elrond or Celebrimbor or any of them, the elves are petty and they're short-sighted and they're selfish and they're manipulative, whereas the elves should be mysterious, and they should be otherworldly, and they should be wise, and they should be patient, and they should be full of grace, almost kind of lit from within. We should be in awe of the elves. And whether you're talking about like the wood elves like Legolas, or an elf like Galadriel played by Cate Blanchett in Fellowship of the Ring, I was just blown away by the elves in the original trilogy. The elves were an enormous source of pride for J.R.R. Tolkien. He invented their whole fucking alphabet and language just to help support and enrich their culture and their history as he was writing it. And god damn, this show is just seriously dropping the ball. Anything and everything related to the elves, in particular, the way they've now basically used Elrond trying to orchestrate this situation where they can be exposed to a giant pile of mithril and get their mojo back. I really, truly despise that subplot. I think that subplot more than anything is what broke me in this episode, because up until now, the subplot with Elrond and Durin was one of the stronger aspects of this show, and then the show just decided to vomit all over itself. And in spite of the fact that Gil Galad is one of the biggest badasses in all of Tolkien's lore, he's written like a complete moron. He had this like pseudo-intellectual just river of nonsense coming out of his mouth at one point, trying to describe the nature of hope to Elrond. I was like, did y'all even like read what you wrote prior to handing over the script to the actors? Like, this is complete and total just tripe. And another character who continues to be frustrating is Isildur. Honestly, this show has no idea what to do with that character, apart from just making him seem ridiculous and like a fool every step of the way. Elendil is a little more noble and a little more interesting, but oh my god, yeah, Isildur, once again, giant missed opportunity. This is a string of missed opportunities where these are failing to capitalize on great characters and great opportunities for drama or excitement or whatever the case might be. What I really need to see or really want to see is Arondir just going on a murderous rampage and just tearing apart orcs, either next episode or the episode after. But he's consistently been the only character for me who at least doesn't say things constantly that annoy the crap out of me. And he seems to be the only person in that tower who knows his ass from his elbow in a fight. So I hope he'll basically just pull a Legolas and take on just hundreds of orcs single-handedly. But in this giant cast of characters, there are far too few that are remotely interesting. I think the big failure of the show, or one of the big failures, is that they started with the entire cast all at once, and they've never been able to really get their momentum going. Whereas if you look back at Fellowship of the Ring or The Hobbit, they always start small. They start with a few characters, and then they grow and grow, and you add a few more, and you add a few more. And so by the time you get to like the Battle of Pelennor Fields outside of Minas Tirith and Return of the King, it's earned, and you're invested in all these characters. But one character who has some potential in my eyes is Halbrand. Even though I really detest all of his interactions with Galadriel, at least we get some cool moments watching him make weapons and that sort of thing. He at least seems to know what he's doing to some degree, and he keeps alluding to all these horrible things that he did in the past to survive. But by the end of this episode, he's all armored up and ready to join Galadriel and the rest of the Númenóreans on this voyage east. And speaking of this voyage, I love how they, even though it's an entire island nation devoted to sailing, somehow with the sabotage of two ships, like, all right, well, now we're totally screwed. We can only send 3 ships east. It's like, really? Like, your entire country is devoted to sailing and exploration. Maybe you could spare a ship or two or build a ship or two. I mean, it almost seems like this show thinks the audience is too stupid not to notice when they're just being lazy in their storytelling, and that's incredibly frustrating. And I guess if I were looking for a positive or something that's got my curiosity, or at least got me on the hook, I was curious to learn more about why the stranger's arm is looking so funky after he comes to the aid of Nori against those wargs or those wolves or whatever they were. And we see how he's basically spacing out over a pool of water, and just by having his hand submerged in it, starts to freeze. Nori touches it, she starts to freeze as well. I don't really know what they're building toward, but at a minimum, I was like, all right, you're going to be some sort of wizard of some kind. I mean, famously, there were 5 that came to Middle-earth in the Third Age. I don't really know where they're going with that character. I have a feeling the destination is going to drive me crazy, but for now, at least, I am curious as to who he is and what role he's going to play. And my assumption is that the land that the Harfoots are exploring, and how they were noticing how it's rotting and it's decaying, and much more so than in the past, I think that is the land that will eventually become so uninhabitable it will be Mordor. It just hasn't gotten to that state quite yet. So I'm making myself depressed even talking about this show, and I want to end on a positive note because I do love the fantasy genre intensely. And as I mentioned in my last video about this show last Thursday, I had just started reading The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, and I'll just say that I'm about a third of the way into it. All my excitement that I was feeling in the first few pages has been 100% confirmed. So far, it's one of the greatest fantasy reading experiences that I've ever had. So if you're looking for a great fantasy read, The Name of the Wind will absolutely deliver. And the other is that I'm introducing 3 players on Sunday to the game of Dungeons & Dragons. I have my regular Monday night game with 5 other players, but some of my friends have expressed curiosity about the game, so I'm going to be inviting some more people into that world. And so I still love and adore everything about the fantasy genre. I don't love this show, but I will continue watching it until the bitter end just to see how it all turns out. But it's been a very long day. I'm totally wiped out. So I'm going to wrap up this video. I hope I didn't alienate all the Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power fans out there, but I can't imagine that my comments are that surprising. Even if you love this show, I'm sure you've been encountering some people online who've been expressing their frustrations with this show. So yeah, chalk me up as somebody who is increasingly becoming disillusioned by the idea that this show will ever manage to stick the landing or redeem itself. But who knows? Maybe in season 2 they can learn from their many mistakes they've made so far in season 1. So if I didn't completely turn you off with this just river of negativity, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and if you want to tell me how wrong I am, hunt me down on Twitter at Geeking Out, and we can talk more about fantasy there. But I can't thank you enough for listening to my rant, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.